Hey y'all, this is Brown at Brown, and today we're going to be talking about The Crow, the special edition by James O'Barr. So before I get into it, I just want to give a quick little shout out to my friend Jeremy, who was kind enough to let me borrow this book and finally get a chance to read it. So thank you very much, Jeremy. It was a dark but wonderful read. So The Crow was a comic book that originally came out in 1989, and it was written and illustrated by James O'Barr. And it was also the basis of the movie of the same name, which came out in 1994, and it was in turn directed by Alex Proya, and it starred the late Brandon Lee. But The Crow, the movie, was one of my favorites, and I've been fascinated as to where it came from, because I mean I'd heard all sorts of things about the comic book from which it was based, but I never really gotten a chance to find it or sit down and read it up until this weekend. And so having finally been able to do so, I could definitely see like there were lines of dialogue in the comic that as I came across them, I remembered them being spoken in the movie. I'm like, so I made the connections and everything. And the book and the movie are, while they definitely have a lot of similarities with each other, and The Crow as a movie overall was, in my opinion, a fairly faithful adaptation of the comic from which it came. I think also that there are differences in both the movie and the comic that made it to where, while there are obviously a lot of similarities, and you can see that one came from the other, they're both their own independent creatures, as it were. But The Crow, though, as it originally came out, it was in 1989, written and illustrated by James O'Barr, and it was initially under an independent comic book company called Caliber. But James O'Barr would basically kind of be going between comic book companies. He'd be going from one to the other, because maybe like one company would collapse, and so he wasn't able to get the story finished, and so you have to go to another comic book company to continue the next chapter, and so on and so forth. But eventually he was able to get the story complete. And this hardcover, which is from 2017, collects not only the story as it was originally published, but also it has several extra segments and chapters that James O'Barr had originally wanted to include in the story when he was originally working on it, but for various reasons was unable to do so. And so now what we have here is not only the whole story, but we have further insight into the tormented mind of the protagonist, Eric Draven, as well as a much deeper look into the dark world he inhabits, both physically and spiritually. But The Crow, as a story, it came from a source of tragedy in James O'Barr's life, namely the loss of his fiancée, who was killed by a drunk driver. And it was something that he blamed himself for. James O'Barr blamed himself for it for quite some time, but eventually, all that raw emotion, the grief, the anger, the longing, just the outright mourning, it all gave him an inspiration, to, come up with, one of the, darkest, love stories slash revenge stories slash gothic tragedies ever put to page. And so even though, like, say, the Crow, it's definitely a staple amongst goth culture, I think it's also something that a lot of people who are more, say, mainstream centric can find a lot to identify with. I mean, it might be too much for them in terms of, say, the content and the tone, but in terms of, say, like the raw emotions, I mean, whether you're goth or not, you can't deny the raw power of the emotional the emotional aspects of this book. So, um, yeah, I mean, it was something to read. I mean, it really was. Yeah, I enjoyed reading it, but there were moments where I just kind of had to stop for a sec, simply because of how James O'Barr was able to convey something like an emotion that felt authentic. It's like you when when you read something, uh, whether it be a book or comic book, and the writer and or illustrator, they do such a good job of putting you in the moment, and getting it to where, even though it's just a fictional character, I mean, you can definitely sympathize with what they're going through and what have you. And so, even if, say, you haven't had as tragic of a loss as, say, having a friend or a loved one killed by a drunk driver, I mean, we all have experienced tragedy at some point. And so when we find that vibe, when we find that similarity with something fictional, I mean, it makes it all the more powerful. And so um so yeah, I mean, it was, like I said, it was definitely something to read. But yeah, so the basic story of The Crow, you know, as I mentioned, the movie followed it rather well while also being its own thing. But the story of the comic book, though, is basically you have the character of Eric and his fiancée Shelly, who are a loving couple, and basically, um, they're trying to build a life for themselves. Um, they're initially, they live kind of in this rundown apartment, but they're able to buy a house, and they're in the process of putting it together, and they're really looking forward to building a life there, and maybe even having kids together. And so basically, just a loving couple. And you see how much Shelley loves Eric, and vice versa. And it's something that, if you've ever been in love, I mean, you could definitely appreciate that that portion of the story comes from a place that's real. Like, it's coming from say, the memory of lost love. Because, I mean, we all have that moment. We've all had that moment, I think, where we've all had that time where we've been with someone, and we're like, hey, this is the one. I can build a life with this person. And in this instance, I mean, they are in the process of building a life together. But unfortunately, though, one day, they're out taking a drive after having had a picnic on the beach, and the car breaks down. And so Shelly's in the car while Eric's trying to fix it, because Eric is a mechanic. Like, he knows how to fix things. Like, he's helped neighbors out before, and things like that. But unfortunately, this is something that is a little out of his hands. Like, it is something that, hey, we're actually gonna need to take this to a mechanic to. But unfortunately, though, it's right about then that they're accosted by a gang of hoodlums who are not only high out of their minds on possibly cocaine, or something similarly strong, but even without the cocaine, they're just straight up evil. And so they see this couple on the side of the road, and they're thinking, hey, easy pickings, right? And so Eric's telling Shelley to stay in the car because he's getting a vibe from these guys, and they're sort of tauntingly offering to help the couple, and but then Eric's like, no, we don't want any trouble, please just leave us alone. But unfortunately, that sets the gang leader off, and and the gang, as a and the gang itself as well, because, I mean, they were already planning on doing harm to the couple, but they're just looking for an excuse. And so when Eric's basically telling him just to please leave him alone, the gang, they see that, and they're like, this guy's begging, what a waste, and so, basically, they end up, shooting him in the head, and then they assault his girlfriend and rape her and then kill her in a rather horrible way. And um, and Eric, he, like, she dies instantly, but Eric somehow, he's still alive, but he's, sort of bordering on life and death. Like, he hears everything, and he hears her screams and what have you, and he sees this crow, that's just kind of watching him, and then watching what's going on, and then just kind of knowingly looking at him. And he's taken to a hospital, once someone else, they find the couple, on the side of the road after the gang's departed, and the authorities are called, and both Eric and Shelly are taken to the hospital. Shelly, of course, is DOA, but Eric somehow, I mean, he's still alive, but there's like a very slim chance for him, like, if any. And there's this police captain, ironically named Captain Hook, who comes in, to personally, apologize to Eric, for what happened, because, this is something that, he sees a lot of, and in this particular instance, I mean, even if he has an idea of, who did it, it's something that, because of how corrupt the city is that they live in, they'd have a hard time actually finding proof and making it stick, making the charges stick on the guys. And so, he's just like, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but I'm sorry. I'm going to do everything I can, to, get these guys, but I don't know. And so, and then Eric, he actually, whispers, and then he sort of shouts, at the guy, or just whoever's listening. He's saying, the crow, and the Captain Hook and some of the hospital staff, they're like, wait, he's alive, or he's speaking, right? Because he was kind of comatose. But then, shortly after, saying, the crow, Eric dies. But, while his mortal story ends, his immortal story begins. And that's when he's brought back as a sort of, revenant, like entity, as in, I mean, he's, human and everything, like, or as in he's humanoid, like he still has, flesh and blood and everything, but he can't die. Like, you shoot him, I mean, he might feel the pain, but it doesn't kill him. You stab him, same thing. And, basically, he finds himself having been resurrected, by this crow, who also kind of acts as this, mentor to him, or as a kind of like this, helper, because, the crow's kind of guiding him, through, say, limbo, which kind of consists of, this, dreamy, landscape, oftentimes filled with, fields and, fog. And, he's trying to tell Eric, to focus on, getting revenge on the guys who did this to them, but also trying not to dwell on what happened, because he knows the crow knows that, the memory of what happened to him, while it is driving him, if he keeps, flashing back on it, it's something that can destroy him. And if the memory of it all destroys him, then he won't be able to, say, get revenge on the guys who killed him and his fiancée. And so there'll be these moments where, Eric's remembering, a happier time with Shelly, and then, he'll start to, go towards, that really bad day where they came across the hoodlums, or the hoodlums came across them, and the crow keeps trying to say, don't look, basically saying, don't look at it, or don't think about it, don't go there. And so, you know, as from a narrative standpoint, it kind of goes back and forth between the present and the past, memory and reality. And so you'll have, these segments where, Eric's, going after these gang members one by one and killing them in really horrific ways, but deservedly so. And, and you see the gang members, that are still alive, they're all, freaking out because they're hearing that there's this guy who's hunting for them, and from, like, say, either the last words of some of the people he killed, or maybe from some of the few people he let live, they're saying that this is someone that they killed or thought they had killed. And they're giving specific details, like the type of car, or what the couple looked like. And at that point, the gang's like, that's impossible, we killed them both. And so so in the meantime, though, while Eric's putting the screws to this gang, he's also trying to help some of the people that there are some people in the neighborhood he tries to help, because they're in a hellish situation. Like, there's this little girl named Shelly that he ends up helping her, because it turns out that he was actually going after, he was trying to find this one gang member who was basically sleeping with Sherry's mom. And Sherry's mom, she was basically kind of a drug addicted hooker, and didn't really take good care of her daughter, Sherry. And so Sherry was oftentimes left by herself. And so Eric, while there's a reason that he's tracking down Sherry's mom, he does make a point to basically befriend her and spend time with her, and find, like, say, a non-corrupt police officer to take her to a better place, to say a better home, as it were. And so just little things like that. And also, one of the other things that comes into play is, maybe it's his otherworldly connection with the afterlife, but cats, really, take a liking to him. And there'll be times where, there'll be like an army of cats, following him, or, waiting to guide someone, to safety that, he's, trying to get away from what he's about to do, and little things like that. And so you have these, nice little touches, that, basically, reinforce the otherworldly feel of the situation. Because while this is a vengeance story, we're dealing with, say, the spiritual realm as well. And, it's a very intriguing, look at how, someone who's, in between life and death, and what they can do, and, like, the abilities that they have. But you also have, like, a dark sense of humor as well, or in the sense that Eric, he'll be, doing these limericks while, he's stalking, the gang members, or, he'll might have a darkly comedic joke for them. Like, he goes up to this one guy and he says something to the effect of, Jesus Christ walks into an inn, and he puts 3 nails down and asks the innkeeper, hey, can you put me up for the night? And I remember that from the movie, and so when I saw it in the comic book, I'm like, son of a gun. But anyway, though, so yeah, I mean, you have this character who, while is definitely a supernatural avenger, and is definitely skilled in hand-to-hand combat, probably from the fact that, one, he can't die, and two, I mean, he probably got some inspiration, he probably got some method of training from like how to use his abilities and what have you, when he was still in limbo. But you also just you also have the moments where he's by himself, or he's with the cat that he and his fiance had, and basically that's like his one source of comfort, that, and the memories of being with Shelly. But then it'll be like every time he's remembering something good about her, about their time together, it all starts to go back to that bad time, that bad day when they cross paths with the gang. And it isn't until, say, the end of the book where we finally see what happens, and we're kind of like, yeah, we definitely understand why the crow was telling him, don't go there, don't go there. And there's also something symbolic, because earlier in the story, when he's still in limbo, he's on this train which is being driven by this sort of skeletal conductor, and he's looking out, and Eric's looking out the window, and the crow's with him, of course. But he looks out the window and he sees this beautiful horse running through the field, but then it gets snagged in barbed wire, and the crow's trying to tell Eric, don't look at it, just look away. It's look away. But eventually, though, this horse, kind of turns up later on in the story, where he's kind of, where he's sort of back in the spirit realm, and he sees the horse, being constricted by all this barbed wire, and the crow's trying to tell him, it's not your fault, and so it goes from initially telling him don't look at it or just look away, to finally, when he's basically looking the horse in the eye, the crow's telling him, you don't have to blame yourself. There's nothing you could do. And so Eric, he does the one thing he can do for the horse, and he puts it out of his misery. He takes a gun, shoots it in the head, and that's when the conductor comes out of the train, which was nearby in the field, and the skeletal conductor, says, "Hey kid, nice shot," because this is the point where in the story where Eric, after he's completed his mission of vengeance, he's finally able to accept the fact that he was in a situation that he was helpless in, and there was nothing he could have done. And so he was able to basically make peace with that, and that was like symbolic of that. I mean, of him putting the horse out of its misery, and he was basically accepting what happened, but also it's like the fact that he was able to get revenge for what happened to him and Shelly. That was kind of something that you get an idea was a cathartic experience for him, but at the end of the day, he had to confront the pain and the loss of what happened. And there are moments where he does try to dull the pain, like he takes these he takes, like, I forgot if it was heroin or cocaine or what, but like it was something that was injectable, and like he literally would inject it in his heart, and just to kind of get a high and maybe just forget about things for a bit. But unfortunately, because he can't die, I mean, it just makes things worse. And so you have him going back and forth between gleefully slaughtering the gang members, and then going to, say, trying to help someone, and then trying to escape the memory of what happened to him and his wife, and then finally accepting it. And eventually, once his mission's complete, and once he's confronted exactly what happened, like the memory of it all, he's able to eventually move on. And you get the idea that he's going to be moving on from limbo and be with Shelly wherever she is, because there are also these images that he gets of this woman in a black shawl, it's like on a beach somewhere, and just kind of looking in his direction, and the crow keeps telling him, when she finally looks at you, don't look away. and you get the idea that that's Shelly, but he can't bring himself to look at her because, one, at the time, he hasn't completed his mission of vengeance, and two, he hasn't confronted the horror of what happened to him. And so when he finally does, he's able to look at her, and then you get the idea that, like, you see these two graves, side by side, and basically, Eric's saying something to the effect of, you know, I'm going home with you now, Shelly, or something along those lines. And that's basically how the story ends. But yeah, this was something that I thought was very dark and very profound, and at times unexpectedly beautiful. Because when he's not, say, going after the gang members, or when you're not in the grim and gritty urban landscape that the story takes place in, you have these beautiful moments, these beautiful memories that he has of being with Shelly, and you see just how much the two of them loved each other. And I remember there was this really beautiful scene where basically Shelly had covered their entire bedroom with Christmas lights, because she wanted him to make love to her, underneath the Christmas lights. And he's like, initially you're like, okay, how are we gonna do this with a Christmas tree? But then it's like, oh, lights in the bedroom, okay. And it's just a little nice little memories like that. And so it's like you really feel a sadness for what happened to the couple, and you understand why Eric's doing what he's doing, and just how much it all has affected him. But yeah, I thought that the writing and the artwork, both by James O'Barr, were very well done. And I think that, there were a couple of times where, especially when he's remembering like the good stuff that happened with his fiancée, like, and then it cuts to, say, him being by himself in the house they used to have, just like with the cat or something, or if he's trying to numb himself, like when he's injecting himself, it's like sometimes like there's dialogue, and then other times there's no dialogue. It's just like raw visual. It's almost like you're seeing a ballet almost in some of the pictures, because it's like you're seeing this character sort of tormented and grimacing, or throwing up his arms to his head and what have you. And it looks very real, and I think that goes a long way towards making the book as memorable as it is. And that's one of the reasons why it's had such a impact over the years with a lot of people, because both from a written standpoint and from an artistic standpoint, James O'Barr, he was able to basically tap into that raw series of emotions that come with tragedy. And so it was something that a lot of people could relate to. Albeit maybe through different circumstances, mind you, but we've all felt something that's brought us low like that before, I think, to some degree. But yeah, just it's something that I'm glad that I finally got a chance to read this book. And I think that I think maybe had I read it when I was younger, I think a lot of it might have disturbed me, or put me off, because at the time I think I wasn't mature enough to say appreciate that there is there is beauty that can come from tragedy. And like I could understand the concept on paper, but I couldn't really say appreciate it at the time. Whereas now it's kind of like I get it, and so yeah, this was something that I was very glad to finally be able to sit down and read. And I think that there's a reason that it's regarded as such a classic in the comic book scene, because I mean, you got something that, I mean, yes, it's, I mean, from a visual and aesthetic standpoint, it's definitely, you know, I guess you could say a, a fixture in the goth scene, but it's also something that I think, people who are, as I mentioned earlier, who are more mainstream centric, there are things in this book that they can relate to, I think. Even if, say, the whole story goes over their heads, they can at least appreciate, the emotional aspect of it. But the one thing that I think could be considered a con, as it were, or I guess you could say the one quibble I had with the book, is that it does get a little confusing. The whole going back and forth. Because like he goes from the present to the past to the present to the past, and so you'll be kind of getting invested in whatever's going on in the present, which is his mission for vengeance. But then it'll go to something in the past. But then just when you're getting invested in, say, a very beautiful memory from the past, then it's back into the grim urban, landscape, where he's, slicing and dicing and shooting bad guys. And so I think part of that could just be chalked up to the fact that this was, James O'Barr's, first go at doing a comic book. And so like the scene transitions could be a little bit jarring at times, but overall though I found that to be a minor quibble. And and I was gonna say in the introduction, and I might have mentioned it earlier, I can't remember if I mentioned it earlier, but in the introduction of the book, he talked about how Will Eisner and Bernie Wrightson were two comic book artists who inspired him. And so while the tragedy of the loss of his fiancée is the main source of inspiration, and where it all came from, in terms of, say, how the action scenes are done, I can definitely see where he was inspired by Will Eisner. And also when it came to, say, the lighting and the shadow and the lighting and the shading, you could definitely see shades of Bernie Wrightson, so to speak. And because like when it comes to, say, like the action scenes and what have you, they're very well choreographed. They're very brutal, but there's a slickness to it all. Whether like he's slicing off legs, or blowing people's brains out and what have you, there's like a cinematic grace to it. But it's almost like because of the lighting and the shading, there's definitely a noir aspect to it too. I mean, something that predates Sin City, by Frank Miller's Sin City. And it also kind of, brought to mind like the visual feel, in a lot of ways reminded me of some of the early Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comic books, because when that series came out, it wasn't exactly kid friendly. It was mainly because of how violent it was. And eventually, though, I mean, that particular series became more kid friendly because of the cartoon. But like, if you look at, say, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and then you look at The Crow, like both titles came from independent comic book companies, and there was like a rawness and a grittiness, to both stories. And so, it just kind of made me think of, that particular title. I mean, although they're two very different things, obviously. But I think that James O'Barr did a really good job of, conveying like this hellish urban landscape, that you could, practically, smell the fumes in the sky, or you could hear the sink dripping and things like that, or you could smell, the, rancid, back rooms of the bars and stuff like that. But then when it came to, say, like the action scenes and what have you, you're, just kind of like, whoa, and just, caught up in, the cinematic, violent grace of it all. But then you'd have the moments where, he's, remembering his time with Shelly, and for just a little while, you're in this, warm, safe moment. And it's like just a pause from it all. But then, of course, life goes on, and so does, reality. And and it goes back to Eric remembering that, you know, that was the past, and this is where he is now. This is what he has to do. And also while trying to confront the memory of what happened. But I also thought that, I liked how, in terms of, say, the afterlife stuff, I liked how, I mean, you got the gist of what was going on in a sense that, the crow was kind of like his mentor, and the horse was symbolic of, um, him blaming himself for what happened and what have you. Uh, I kind of wish that there'd been a little more exposition into to say the afterlife, like, what was. I mean, it would have been cool to see more of the skeleton train conductor. I mean, I thought that was a pretty cool touch. I mean, just from a visual standpoint, but it would have been cool if there'd been some further interaction, with him and Eric and what have you. Also, it just because it's like you get these fascinating glimpses of limbo and what it's like and everything, whereas in most of the time, where where when we're with Eric, it's in the urban reality of the city, but we get these moments of the afterlife, and they're fascinating to see, and I kind of wish that we'd seen more of them. But at the same time, I'm kind of glad that we didn't get like an in-depth explanation as to what was going on with the afterlife. We knew that yes, the crow, you know, brought him back, and the crow was helping him, guiding him, but we don't know, say, you know, we don't know for sure like how the crow helped him out in the sense of, say, like combat training and what have you. We can infer that, but there are some things that I felt like worked because they were left unsaid, whereas there were a couple other things that I wish that we could have explored a little more. But overall, though, I think that because of the main focus was Eric's mission of vengeance, and the fact that he was trying to put off confronting the memory of what happened with him and his fiancée, what was done to them. He was trying to put that off for so long that by the time he finally does confront it, I mean, it devastates him. But because of the fact that he's killed all the guys that were a part of it, he's actually able to confront it with a sense of accomplishment. Like, it's not going to bring Shelly back, but at the same time, they're no longer breathing air on this earth. And so, the memory of it all still hurts him. But basically, I liked how, when we got to that point, I mean, as traumatic as it was, because it is very dark, very brutal when you see what happens to them. But when we finally see what happens, it's only after Eric's cleared the board of these villainous scumbags. And I thought that was an interesting way of doing it, because some stories would have it to where you see first and foremost what happened with, say, a loved one, like, say, the first Death Wish movie. I mean, Charles Bronson's wife and daughter are assaulted by a gang within the like at the near the beginning of the movie, right then and there. Whereas here with the crow, I mean, that something happened to them, and from dialogue you can get an idea of what happened. But then when we finally do see it happen, it's only at the end. And so when you get to that moment where after he remembers everything, and he's confronted by that horse that's being constricted by the barbed wire, and he puts it out of his misery, I mean, that's the point where he's able to accept the fact that there was nothing he could do, and it wasn't his fault. And so I think that actually worked. I mean, while the narrative transition I thought was jarring at times, I think that in this particular instance, the fact that you saw what happened to him, his fiance, at the end of the book or towards the end of the book worked better than, say, having it at the beginning. So, but yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give The Crow 5 out of 5 stars. This was a very well written, very wonderfully illustrated book, and it's, I definitely agree with that. It's a classic amongst comic book fans, and or it's just a classic comic book in general. It's definitely a milestone in the sense of, say, independent comics as well. So if you get a chance, you should definitely check this particular edition out. It's a hardcover. It came out in 2017. Amongst other things, it has an introduction from James O'Barr, kind of giving you kind of like a behind the scenes look at what went into making the book. And also, I mean, just, being able to look at the black and white artwork is just amazing, because another comparison to the early Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics that comes to mind is the fact of, just how gritty and rough, the artwork is when Eric's, going after the gang members in the present, in the urban landscape. I mean, visually speaking, it does kind of look like something from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, except, a little bit more on the goth side of things. But then when he's, say, remembering things with Shelly, or when he's in limbo, there's almost like a painted look to things. And so you definitely have some wonderful artwork to look at here, and James O'Barr definitely doesn't have anything to be ashamed of. I mean, even if, say, I don't know if he's done anything besides The Crow, but even if he hasn't, I mean, if you've only done one thing and it happens to be this, I mean, hey, you're good. So yeah, James O'Barr's The Crow, 5 stars out of 5. Definitely check this out if you can. Not for little kids, obviously, because of the content and subject matter, but I'd say, like older teenagers and above, yeah, definitely, worth checking out. So thanks for taking the time to check out my review, and I hope you like what you see here. And if you do, please feel free to like and subscribe. So if you got any questions, comments, feel free to drop a line as well. So, take care. Have a good day. Bye.